The neighborhood looked pristine on the surface, the kind of place where outsiders believed life unfolded without chaos, where white fences and manicured lawns convinced anyone driving through that this was a perfect slice of suburban calm. At first glance, there was little reason to suspect otherwise. Each home matched the next in its carefully chosen shades of beige or gray. Driveways sparkled as if they had been power-washed weekly, and the sidewalks appeared free of even a stray leaf. To the uninitiated, it looked like the very picture of order and serenity. But to those who lived within the confines of the association's reach, there was another side, one hidden behind neighborly smiles and quarterly dues. The Homeowners Association wasn't just a governing body here. It was a shadow that loomed over every aspect of daily life. The rules were strict, the enforcement even stricter, and the personalities at the top of the board seemed to thrive on flexing control at the expense of those who simply wanted to enjoy their homes in peace. It was the kind of place where leaving your garbage bin visible for an hour too long could spark a warning letter, or painting your front door a shade darker than approved could turn into a months-long battle. I had seen my share of such environments during my career, but this one was personal. My wife and I had moved here under the impression that we were securing a peaceful place to settle down, a neighborhood that would offer safety, quiet, and a sense of belonging. We didn't realize that behind the perfect lawns and friendly handshakes lay an undercurrent of politics, pettiness and control that would eventually test our patience, our safety, and even our marriage. The first months seemed promising. My wife thrived on decorating the house, creating a welcoming backyard oasis and cultivating flower beds that brightened the edges of our property. She enjoyed spending time outdoors, chatting with the few neighbors who seemed genuinely warm, and filling our evenings with laughter as we watched the sunset together from the porch. I enjoyed watching her happiness, especially after years of demanding schedules and long nights away. It felt like we had finally found a space where we could breathe, a home that was truly ours. But then the letters began. At first, they were small notices slipped into the mailbox, gentle reminders, the association called them. The grass had grown a quarter-inch higher than approved standards. A seasonal wreath on our door was deemed non-compliant. The solar lights lining the walkway were not part of the approved exterior decor package. My wife laughed them off at first, assuming they were harmless quirks of an overzealous board. But as weeks stretched into months, the notes grew in both frequency and severity. Each message carried an undertone of accusation, as if we were somehow undermining the entire neighborhood's harmony by daring to personalize our own space. We soon learned the name that would come to dominate so much of our daily lives: the HOA president, a woman whose reputation for micromanagement was whispered about by nearly every neighbor. Some called her determined. Others called her meddlesome, but privately, most referred to her as a Karen in the truest sense of the word, unyielding, unreasonable, and unwilling to let anyone exist outside of her carefully constructed rules. She had her eyes on us from the beginning. My wife, with her vibrant garden and tendency to decorate for every season, was viewed as someone who drew too much attention, someone who dared to inject individuality into a community designed for uniformity. The president seemed determined to remind us at every turn that we were under her authority, bound by the same rigid guidelines she enforced like a personal creed. At first, I chose patience. Years in my profession had taught me that escalation only created more tension. But patience in this environment was mistaken for weakness, and weakness, when perceived by someone who thrived on control, became an invitation for further interference. The first confrontation happened on a bright Saturday morning, though confrontation might be too strong a word for what it was. It was more a demonstration, a reminder of power. My wife had been tending to the flower beds along the side of the house when the president arrived, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning every inch of our property as though searching for evidence. I watched from the porch as she scribbled notes, her lips pursed into a thin line, before slipping yet another envelope into our mailbox and walking off without so much as a greeting. My wife carried the envelope inside, her cheerful mood diminished by the weight of yet another reprimand. This time, It was about the color of the birdhouse hanging from our tree. According to the notice, it clashed with the approved palette of the neighborhood and needed to be removed immediately. It was absurd, even laughable, but I saw the way it unsettled her. What began as annoyance was slowly turning into a quiet dread, a constant second-guessing of every choice she made in her own yard. Still, we endured. We complied with some requests, ignored others, and tried our best to maintain a sense of peace. But the more we attempted to stay out of conflict, the more the association seemed determined to pull us in. It wasn't just the president either. Her influence spread across the board, infecting even those who might have otherwise been reasonable. Fines began arriving in the mail, citations for minor infractions we hadn't even realized were violations. Rumors circulated among neighbors, whispers that we were troublemakers who thought the rules didn't apply to us. Through it all, my wife remained resilient. She tended her garden, greeted the few neighbors who stood by us, and tried to brush off the negativity with a grace that humbled me. But I could see the toll it was taking. Her smile grew a little tighter each time she opened a notice, her laughter a little shorter as the pressure mounted. The tension reached a new height when we decided to host a small gathering in our backyard. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a few friends, some food, and music that barely carried beyond the fence. Yet within an hour, the president appeared at the edge of our property, her expression sharp with disapproval. She lingered long enough to make her presence felt, then disappeared, only for us to receive another citation the following week for excessive noise and unauthorized use of property for large gatherings. That was when I began to sense that this was no longer about rules. This was personal. I had seen this pattern before, though in far different contexts. The slow escalation of control, the attempts to break down resistance through intimidation and persistence. The president had marked us, and she was determined to make an example out of us. For months, the back and forth continued. We would comply. She would find another reason to write us up. We would ignore. She would escalate to threats of fines and hearings. And through it all, my wife stood at the center of the storm, enduring the weight of each attack while trying to hold on to the peace we had once believed this neighborhood could provide. It was during this period that something shifted. I noticed more of the board members watching us when we drove by, more neighbors whispering as we walked the dog. The citations became increasingly arbitrary, the fines more aggressive, and then late one evening as I returned from a long day, I saw a car idling near our home, its occupants watching our house, with a gaze that felt far from friendly. That was the first moment I realized the association's tactics were no longer confined to letters and fines. The HOA had built its power on intimidation, but until then, it had been the kind of intimidation wrapped in bureaucracy and paper. What I saw that night suggested something different, something darker. And though I didn't yet know the full extent of what was to come, a chill settled over me as I realized we were being drawn into a conflict that was far from ordinary. What began as letters about birdhouses and garden decor was transforming into something that reached beyond the petty control of a neighborhood board. It was becoming personal in a way that threatened more than just peace of mind. And though I had spent years preparing for confrontations of every kind, nothing unsettled me more than the idea of my wife being dragged into danger because of the unchecked power of an HOA president who couldn't tolerate resistance. This was only the beginning, and as I stood on the porch that evening, watching the taillights of the car disappear into the night, I knew with certainty that the storm ahead would test every limit of my patience, my resilience, and my resolve. The HOA had declared war in its own subtle way, and war, no matter how petty its beginnings, always escalated. The morning after that unsettling night lingered with a sense of unease. On the surface, nothing had changed. The lawns still gleamed with artificial perfection, neighbors still waved with rehearsed politeness, and the HOA continued its endless routine of monitoring compliance. But for me, the presence of that idling car had altered everything. It marked a line between ordinary neighborhood disputes and something more sinister, a transition from petty control to active intimidation. When I mentioned it to my wife, She tried to dismiss the concern, perhaps out of hope that it was nothing more than coincidence. She didn't want to believe that a homeowners association, of all things, could reach into the realm of genuine threat. For her, it was easier to see the situation as an annoyance rather than an escalation. Yet I could tell by the way she avoided glancing at the street that she felt the tension too, even if she didn't say it aloud. The HOA president, meanwhile, seemed emboldened. Within days, another letter arrived, this one more aggressive than the ones before. It cited alleged violations with vague wording, claiming our property was out of harmony with the neighborhood aesthetic. Unlike previous notes, which had listed specific grievances, this one seemed intentionally broad, a blank check for the board to penalize us for anything they chose. Alongside the letter was a notice of an upcoming board hearing, where we were expected to defend ourselves against accusations that weren't even properly defined. It was absurd, but also clever. By framing the issue in such broad strokes, the board could manufacture compliance or fines regardless of what we said. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about power. And the president was ensuring that we understood she could wield it however she pleased. I attended the hearing not out of faith in fairness, but out of necessity. The board gathered in a small room at the community center, their expressions carefully neutral but their loyalties obvious. At the head of the table sat the president, her posture rigid, her eyes sharp with satisfaction. The proceeding unfolded like a performance. Accusations presented with no evidence, rebuttals dismissed as irrelevant, and the outcome predetermined from the moment I stepped inside. They issued another fine, larger than the previous ones, citing our pattern of non-compliance. It was little more than a shakedown, a way to remind us that resistance would be punished financially. But it wasn't the money that unsettled me. It was the smug certainty in the president's eyes, the quiet smile that suggested she believed she had complete control over the situation. For weeks after, the pressure increased. Citations piled up, fines arrived more frequently, and the whispers among neighbors grew louder. Some avoided us altogether, unwilling to risk association with a household marked as problematic. Others offered sympathetic looks, but little else, cowed into silence by the board's influence. My wife tried to maintain her routines, but the weight of constant surveillance was wearing her down. The most telling shift came not from the letters, but from the atmosphere itself. We began noticing unfamiliar vehicles parked at odd hours, sometimes near our house, sometimes idling at the edge of the neighborhood. Strangers appeared in places they had no reason to be, watching with casual disinterest that felt anything but casual. It was as if the HOA was no longer content with bureaucratic intimidation. They were reaching for something more personal, something designed to instill fear beyond paperwork. I had dealt with intimidation before, in contexts far more severe than neighborhood politics, but there was something uniquely unsettling about facing it at home, where peace was supposed to exist. My wife, who once found joy in tending her flowers, now glanced over her shoulder every time she stepped outside. The garden she had nurtured with pride was no longer a sanctuary. It had become another place where she felt exposed, vulnerable to the watchful eyes of unseen adversaries. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the neighborhood bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, I noticed the president herself walking past our property. She didn't stop, didn't say a word, but her gaze lingered just long enough to communicate what the letters and fines had been saying all along. She wasn't finished. It was a calculated act, subtle but deliberate, a reminder that she could exert pressure at will. The following week, a package arrived on our doorstep with no return address. Inside was a stack of printed photos. Our house, our yard, my wife working among her flowers, even shots of her entering and leaving the home. They weren't threatening in the traditional sense, but their message was clear. We were being watched, and someone wanted us to know it. That was the turning point for my wife. The frustration she had endured with patience gave way to fear, and fear gave way to anger. She wanted to confront the board, to demand answers, to call out the invasion of privacy for what it was. But I stopped her. Not because I disagreed with her feelings, but because I recognized the danger in giving them exactly the reaction they wanted. The board thrived on control, and any display of emotion would be used as further justification for their narrative that we were troublemakers. Instead, I focused on observation. I began documenting every letter, every fine, every unusual occurrence in meticulous detail. I noted the dates, the times, the patterns. Years of training had taught me that information was the most powerful tool in dismantling intimidation, and I intended to gather enough to see through the fog of manipulation. Yet, even as I worked to stay ahead of their games, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing. The escalation from letters to photos wasn't random. It was a progression, a deliberate increase in pressure. The president had tested the limits of fines and citations, and now she was pushing into personal territory. The question wasn't whether it would continue to escalate, it was how far she was willing to go. Our neighbors, too, began to show signs of unease. A few whispered to us quietly, suggesting they had faced similar tactics in the past. They spoke of sudden fines after voicing disagreement, of unexplained surveillance when they challenged the board, of intimidation that forced them into submission. Some had considered moving, but the association's control made selling difficult without approval, effectively trapping them within the very system that oppressed them. It became clear that the president wasn't just targeting us individually. She was using us as an example, a warning to others about what happened when you resisted her authority. And in doing so, she was consolidating her power, cementing her position as the unchallenged ruler of the neighborhood. I had seen enough to know where this path led. Intimidation only worked until it didn't, and those who relied on it often overplayed their hand. The president had already crossed the line into personal harassment, and each step forward brought her closer to a confrontation she wasn't prepared for. The final sign came late one night, when my wife and I were jolted awake by the sound of motorcycles rumbling through the neighborhood. The roar of engines shattered the quiet, echoing against the carefully maintained homes. I stepped onto the porch in time to see a group of bikers cruising slowly down the street, their presence out of place in the otherwise pristine environment. They didn't stop, didn't speak, but their appearance carried an unmistakable message. My wife clutched my arm, her fear palpable. It was one thing to receive letters or fines. It was another to witness strangers invading the neighborhood under the cover of darkness. This wasn't coincidence. This was orchestration, and in that moment, the truth crystallized. The HOA president had escalated beyond bureaucracy, beyond surveillance, into something far more dangerous. She wasn't content with fines or rumors anymore. She was willing to bring outsiders into the conflict, to introduce real intimidation into what had begun as a petty neighborhood dispute. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. As the rumble of engines faded into the distance, I knew Chapter 1 of our conflict had ended. The board had declared its intentions with clarity, and the stakes had been raised to a level that could no longer be ignored. What they didn't realize, however, was that escalation works both ways, and while they believed they were tightening their grip, they had just set into motion a series of events that would unravel everything they thought they controlled. The storm was no longer coming. It was here. The roar of those motorcycles lingered in our minds long after the engines had faded into silence. For my wife, the sound became a phantom that haunted even the quietest hours, echoing in her thoughts every time she stepped outside. For me, it was confirmation of something I had already suspected. The HOA had taken its game to a new and dangerous level. Petty fines and passive-aggressive letters were no longer enough. The president wanted compliance through fear, and she was willing to escalate until she got it. In the days that followed, subtle signs of change appeared throughout the neighborhood. A few of the more timid residents seemed to avoid eye contact altogether, their glances darting away as though acknowledging us would somehow make them targets as well. Others offered brief, sympathetic looks, quickly swallowed by the fear of being seen aligning with us. The air carried a thickness now, a weight pressing down on every interaction, as though the entire community knew the association had moved from bureaucratic enforcement into something darker. My wife tried to carry on with her daily routines. She tended to the garden, though less frequently, often glancing toward the street as if expecting the sudden thunder of engines again. She took fewer walks in the evenings, reluctant to wander the neighborhood she had once embraced with such joy. What had once been her sanctuary was slowly transforming into a prison, and the bitterness of that loss etched itself onto her face in quiet moments when she thought I wasn't looking. Then came the second appearance. It was a late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the sidewalks when the motorcycles returned. This time they didn't simply pass through. They slowed in front of our house, engines growling low, riders staring with faces hidden behind dark helmets. They didn't speak, didn't move, but their silence carried the weight of intent. They were there to be seen, to be felt, to press upon us the presence of something larger than neighborhood politics. My wife froze at the sight, her hands trembling as she stood on the porch. I stepped closer, placing myself between her and their gaze, though the riders seemed less interested in me than in the impact they had on her. After a tense few moments, they revved their engines and continued down the street, disappearing around the corner. But the damage had been done. Their message was received. That night, my wife couldn't sleep. She lay awake, her body tense, every sound outside amplified by fear. The faintest hum of a distant vehicle sent her upright in bed, eyes wide with panic. I did my best to reassure her, but I knew words would do little against the images burned into her mind. She had seen intimidation before, but never directed so personally, never at her doorstep in the place that was supposed to be safe. The next morning, another letter arrived from the HOA. This one didn't mention grass or decor. Instead, it was a formal notice of violation for disturbances to neighborhood peace and security. The wording was vague, but the implication was clear. They were turning the tables, framing us as the source of disruption. It was a tactic as old as intimidation itself. Shift the blame, create confusion, and weaken resolve. My wife's frustration boiled over. She wanted to report the bikers, to call the police, to demand that someone intervene, but I stopped her gently. Not because I didn't take her seriously, but because I knew the danger of playing into the board's hand. The president wanted us rattled, reactive, making moves that could be spun into justification for further punishment. By lashing out, we would give her exactly what she needed to tighten the noose. So I told her to wait. I would handle it. But waiting was easier said than done. Over the following week, the sightings increased. The bikers never lingered long, never did more than ride through the neighborhood, but their repeated appearances were enough to shred any illusion of safety. My wife stopped tending her garden altogether, her flowers left untended as weeds crept in. She spent more time indoors, curtains drawn, her laughter growing quieter each day. The joy that had once defined her spirit was dimming, replaced by a constant undercurrent of fear. And that was exactly what the president wanted. The more my wife withdrew, the more emboldened the board became. Citations now arrived almost daily, each one more absurd than the last. Improper placement of patio furniture, excessive shade from our trees, unauthorized use of wind chimes. Each notice was less about actual rules and more about psychological warfare, a relentless barrage designed to wear us down until resistance felt futile. Neighbors whispered, but few acted. One elderly couple confided to us in hushed tones that they too had been harassed years before, though never to this degree. They had given in quickly, unwilling to endure the pressure, and had lived quietly ever since. Their story was both a warning and a revelation. This wasn't new. The president had a history of targeting those who resisted, and she had built her reputation on breaking people into submission. But my wife wasn't like others, not entirely. Despite the fear, despite the sleepless nights and trembling hands, there was still a flicker of defiance in her. I saw it when she spoke of the garden she refused to abandon, when she muttered under her breath about the injustice of it all, when she caught herself straightening the curtains with an expression of determination rather than defeat. She was shaken, but she wasn't broken. Not yet. One evening, as I sat on the porch keeping quiet watch, I saw the bikers again. This time they stopped at the corner, their engines idling as they watched from a distance. My wife peeked through the window, her fear palpable, and I felt the weight of the president's strategy pressing down harder than ever. This wasn't random harassment anymore. It was a calculated campaign. designed not just to intimidate, but to break her spirit entirely. And yet, in their arrogance, they made a mistake. The bikers seemed to believe that fear alone would keep us paralyzed, that the sight of their presence would be enough to drive us into compliance. They didn't realize that every appearance, every rev of their engines, every silent stare was only fueling my resolve. They were showing me their methods, their patterns, their tactics. And while my wife suffered under their intimidation, I was quietly preparing. I began keeping more detailed records, noting the exact times and dates of each appearance, the number of riders, the routes they took through the neighborhood. I noticed that their visits always coincided with moments of heightened tension with the HOA, just after a hearing, just after a particularly aggressive letter, just after my wife had shown the faintest spark of defiance. The coordination was too precise to be coincidence. The president wasn't just aware of their actions, she was orchestrating them. The revelation hardened something within me. This was no longer about neighborhood disputes or power struggles over aesthetics. This was targeted harassment, a campaign designed to destroy the spirit of the woman I loved. And that I could not allow. As the days stretched on, the bikers grew bolder. They revved their engines louder, lingered longer, and once one of them even slowed enough to toss a cigarette butt onto our lawn before speeding away. My wife recoiled at the act, a symbolic trespass that pierced deeper than any fine or letter could. She clutched my arm with tears in her eyes, whispering that she couldn't take much more. That was the moment I knew we had reached the breaking point. The HOA president believed she had won. She believed she had reduced my wife to fear. The steady erosion of peace within our home had reached its sharpest edge. By now, the sound of motorcycles had become synonymous with dread. The growl of their engines was no longer just noise, but a signal, a constant reminder that we were being watched, monitored, and manipulated. My wife tried to hold on to scraps of normalcy, clinging to small routines like brewing her morning tea or watering only the houseplants indoors, but her hands shook with every step toward the window. The sanctuary we had once built together now felt like a stage, one where unseen puppeteers pulled strings from shadows. The HOA president was growing impatient. That much was obvious. Her harassment campaign had been systematic, well-timed, and deliberate. But while my wife was undeniably shaken, we had not broken. We hadn't surrendered our home, we hadn't paid off the HOA's fines, and we hadn't bent our heads in submission. This alone was enough to inflame her obsession. For someone so consumed by control, resistance, even in its smallest form, was intolerable. The first sign of escalation arrived not in the form of engines or letters, but through whispers carried on the lips of neighbors. Small clusters of residents began gathering in corners of the street, their voices lowered yet sharp enough for fragments to drift across. Words like rebellion, troublemakers, and bikers floated into the air, wrapped in the nervous laughter of people who feared becoming targets themselves. The HOA's narrative was spreading, crafted carefully to isolate us from the rest of the community. In this narrative, my wife and I weren't victims. We were villains. The official story painted us as agitators, troublemakers stirring chaos where once there was order. Every violation notice, every fabricated citation, every late-night visit from the bikers had been twisted to frame us as the disruptors of peace. And as this story took root, the HOA found fertile ground to justify its next move. That move came on a Friday evening, a time chosen with precision. Weekends carried a heavier presence of residents at home, making the stage larger and the audience unavoidable. The bikers returned, their arrival unmistakable as engines growled through the twilight air. But this time, they didn't linger at the edges of the street. They didn't stop at corners or rev their engines in passing. They stopped directly in front of our house. The thunder of their machines filled the neighborhood, rattling windows and vibrating the very bones of the house. My wife gasped, retreating from the window with tears welling in her eyes. From behind the curtains, I counted them, 6 in total, each one dismounting with a deliberate slowness that screamed intimidation. Their leather jackets bore patches I didn't recognize, but the imagery was clear enough. Skulls, fire, chains. They wanted to look dangerous, and to anyone unaccustomed to confrontation, they succeeded. The lead biker stepped forward, his boots crunching against the pavement, his helmet visor down. He didn't knock, didn't shout, didn't demand. Instead, he simply stood there, a figure of menace carved in silence. The others fanned out casually, leaning against their bikes, arms folded as though they owned the space. Inside, my wife was trembling. She clutched my arm tightly, whispering through her fear that this was too far, that they had finally brought the fight to our doorstep. She wasn't wrong. The game had shifted from harassment to invasion, from intimidation to confrontation. The president had grown tired of waiting for us to bend, so she had pushed the bikers into making the threat undeniable. But as they stood there, expecting fear to pour from every crack of our home, something shifted within me. The patience I had clung to, the restraint I had maintained, began to unravel. I had tolerated the letters, endured the gossip, recorded the subtle acts of intimidation. But this was the line crossed, the threshold shattered. No one threatened my wife at her own home without consequences. Still, I didn't act immediately. I watched, measured, observed. The bikers weren't reckless. They were careful, calibrated, trying to create maximum fear without crossing into outright illegality. They didn't touch the property, didn't step onto the porch, didn't break anything. They simply existed in a way that suffocated. It was psychological warfare executed with a predator's patience. Minutes ticked by, each second stretching like an eternity. Finally, the lead biker raised a hand and tapped his helmet, a gesture meant to draw attention, to signal dominance. Then, without a word, he turned back toward his motorcycle. The others followed, mounting their bikes with practiced ease. Engines roared to life, drowning out the quiet suburban hum, and just as quickly as they had come, they were gone. The silence afterward was heavier than the noise had been. My wife collapsed onto the couch, sobbing quietly into her hands. She had held it together as long as she could, but this was different. This was personal. They had stood there in our space, forcing her to witness their powerlessness over them. She felt hunted, cornered, and stripped of the fragile sense of safety she had clung to. For me, though, the silence was clarity. Their restraint told me everything I needed to know. They weren't freelancers acting on their own whims. They were being directed, their actions choreographed to maximize impact without crossing legal lines. And there was only one person in this neighborhood who had both the motive and the arrogance to wield such a tool. The president had officially declared war. That night, I sat alone long after my wife had fallen into restless sleep. I reviewed every note I had taken, every record of sightings, every violation letter. Patterns emerged more clearly than ever before, forming a map of escalation. Each step had been measured, each act designed to chip away at our defenses until we either surrendered or cracked. But what the president hadn't accounted for was that her tactics, in pushing so far, had awakened something she couldn't control. She believed she had power over the narrative, power over the residents, power over my wife. But she didn't understand me, not really. She didn't know the depths of what I could do when pushed. Her bikers had walked into my life, believing themselves wolves. They had no idea they had entered the territory of someone far more dangerous. The following day, I noticed changes in the neighborhood. Conversations quieted when I walked by. Some neighbors averted their gaze entirely, as if afraid even to be seen acknowledging me. Others, however, gave looks that were harder to decipher. Curiosity, maybe even anticipation. Rumors were spreading fast, whispers that the bikers had stood outside our home like sentinels of menace. And with every retelling, the legend of intimidation grew, bolstering the HOA's narrative of dominance. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Fear has a strange way of uniting people, even those too afraid to act. A few neighbors began leaving subtle signs of solidarity, small nods, sympathetic glances, an extra wave at the mailbox. These gestures were small, almost imperceptible, but they told me one thing. Not everyone believed the HOA's story. Not everyone was content to see us driven out. The president, however, didn't notice or didn't care. Drunk on the illusion of control, she doubled down. More letters arrived, citing absurd violations. More whispers reached my ears, claiming we had disrupted community events we hadn't even attended. And more importantly, the bikers returned again. This time, they didn't just stop. They circled, The sound of engines filled the street as they looped around the block. Again and again, each pass slower and more deliberate than the last. Their presence was no longer subtle. It was a spectacle, designed to draw the eyes of every resident. Curtains twitched, blinds shifted, and the entire neighborhood bore witness to our public humiliation. My wife clutched the arm of the couch, her knuckles white as she whispered that she couldn't live like this anymore. Fear had taken root so deeply that even the walls of our home no longer offered protection. The place that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a cage under siege, and that was when I decided enough was enough. The president wanted to escalate? Fine. She wanted to use bikers as tools of intimidation? Fine. But she had made one critical miscalculation. She believed fear was the only weapon in play. She believed we were ordinary residents, trapped by the rules of her game. She had no idea who she was dealing with. What she saw as submission was preparation. What she mistook as silence was strategy. And what she believed was fear was, in truth, the calm before the storm. The bikers thought they were circling prey. They were wrong. They were circling someone who had spent his life mastering storms they couldn't even imagine, and soon they would learn the difference. By the time the bikers circled for the third night in a row, it was clear their intimidation campaign had reached its climax. Subtlety was gone, patience abandoned. They no longer cared about the veil of plausible deniability the HOA president had clung to. Now, this was theater, a performance meant to crush the last shred of will my wife carried. And in the president's mind, she was winning. But she had mistaken quiet for weakness, silence for fear. What she didn't know was that every note, every sighting, every rev of an engine had been recorded, documented, and mapped. Her escalation wasn't cornering us. It was building a case, stacking evidence like kindling. And when the match was struck, it would burn far brighter than she ever imagined. Still, on that fateful Saturday, I couldn't deny a pang of unease as I prepared to leave the house for a brief errand across town. My wife insisted she would be fine. She had grown weary of feeling trapped, weary of hiding behind curtains and bolted doors. I reminded her that fear was exactly what they wanted. Standing firm wasn't just defiance, it was survival. The streets were quiet when I pulled away, but in my rearview mirror, I caught the glint of chrome under the fading sun. The bikers weren't far. They never were anymore. Back at the house, my wife tried to distract herself. She busied her hands with the dishes, though her eyes flickered constantly toward the windows. The sound of a distant engine sent her heart racing, though she forced herself to breathe, to remain steady. She told herself she wouldn't let them control her anymore, not today. Then the engines came closer. At first it was just one, low, steady, almost cautious. Then another. Then three more until the sound merged into a rolling thunder that shook the air. The floor beneath her feet trembled. This wasn't a drive-by. This was an arrival. The bikers came roaring down the street, 6 of them in total, their presence swallowing the quiet suburban block like a storm cloud blotting out the sun. They didn't stop at the corner this time. They didn't idle on the curb. They pulled directly into the driveway, their bikes aligned like soldiers in formation. My wife froze, her breath catching in her throat. From behind the curtains, she watched as the men dismounted, leather jackets creaking, boots hitting the pavement in heavy thuds. Their helmets came off this time, revealing faces hardened by arrogance and the thrill of intimidation. The leader, a tall man with a scar cutting across his cheek, strode forward with the swagger of someone who had never been challenged. His eyes scanned the house, settling on the faint movement of the curtain where my wife stood. He smirked, raising a hand to signal the others. They fanned out across the yard, their movements deliberate, invasive. One kicked at the edge of the flower bed, scattering soil across the grass. Another tapped his chain idly against his palm, the metallic clink loud enough to carry through the window. They weren't here to talk. They were here to frighten, to corner, to break. Inside, my wife's pulse raced. She could feel the trap closing in, the predatory energy radiating from their presence. For a moment, panic surged. Her instincts screamed to hide, to lock every door, to cower in silence until they left. But then she remembered my words, the look in my eyes when I had promised that fear wasn't the end of the story. She straightened her back. The leader stepped onto the porch, his boots heavy against the wood. He raised his fist and slammed it against the door, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Each pound reverberated through the house, a deliberate test of her resolve. The others laughed, low and mocking, reveling in the spectacle they were creating for the neighbors peeking nervously from their windows. But the door didn't open, and then, within moments, the atmosphere shifted. What the bikers hadn't realized was that they had chosen the wrong house, the wrong woman and the wrong man to threaten. They thought they were delivering a message on behalf of the HOA president. Instead, they had just walked into a storm they weren't prepared for. 3 minutes. That's all it took. One moment, the bikers stood tall, sneering and confident, their presence dripping with menace. The next, their bravado cracked. Fear crept into their eyes, replacing the arrogance that had carried them onto our property. Their voices, once dripping with laughter and mockery, faltered into silence. They hadn't expected resistance. They hadn't expected consequences. And they certainly hadn't expected that the man whose wife they were sent to intimidate wasn't just another suburban resident, but someone who knew how to dismantle threats piece by piece. By the time my truck rolled back into the driveway, the scene was unrecognizable. The bikers who had strutted onto the property with fire in their eyes were now subdued, their shoulders slumped, their eyes darting nervously like cornered animals. The leader's smirk was gone, replaced by the haunted look of someone who had discovered too late that he had overplayed his hand. Engines roared again, but this time with desperation. One by one, the bikers mounted their machines, no longer with swagger but with haste. Tires screeched against the pavement as they peeled away, scattering down the street like dogs fleeing a fight they hadn't been ready for. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as the intimidation backfired spectacularly. Curtains twitched, phones captured fragments of video, and whispers spread like wildfire. The HOA president's perfect image of control was unraveling in real time. And my wife? She stood at the window, her hands still trembling, but her eyes alight with something I hadn't seen in weeks. Relief. No, not just relief. Power. The bikers hadn't broken her. They had shown their weakness, and in doing so, they had reignited her spirit. For the first time in weeks, she smiled. The message was clear. The president had overplayed her hand, and the bikers had learned the hard way that intimidation cuts both ways. But the war wasn't over. Not yet, because if the HOA president was bold enough to send them once, she would surely try again. And next time, she wouldn't just want to scare us, she would want to destroy us. The storm had broken, but its fiercest winds were still to come. The silence that followed the bikers' retreat was heavier than their engines had ever been. For days, the memory of their desperation clung to the neighborhood like smoke after a fire. Residents who had once turned away from us now stared openly, curiosity outweighing their fear. The menacing display that the president had orchestrated had ended in humiliation, and the echoes of that failure spread faster than any of her carefully constructed lies. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, the balance of power shifted. The HOA had relied on fear to maintain control, but fear is fragile. It thrives only so long as people believe in the illusion of invincibility. The moment cracks appear, the entire facade begins to crumble. And the bikers' retreat wasn't just a crack. It was a fracture running straight through the president's empire. Still, she tried to patch it. Within 24 hours, new letters arrived in our mailbox, thick envelopes stuffed with citations that bordered on parody. According to the HOA, our garbage cans were improperly aligned, our mailbox was too reflective in the afternoon sun, and our driveway contained excessive debris, despite being spotless. It was a flailing attempt to reassert dominance, to remind us that she still held the pen, if not the sword. But the neighborhood wasn't buying it anymore. At first, the whispers were cautious. A neighbor at the end of the block muttered about how reckless it had been to involve bikers in a suburban dispute. Another, braver, remarked within earshot of others that intimidation wasn't leadership. And then, gradually, the tide turned. Conversations in driveways grew bolder, criticisms sharper, until the once united silence fractured into open doubt. The president felt it. You could see it in the way she stalked the streets during her daily patrols, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning for infractions, but her jaw set tighter than usual. She barked orders at her board members, demanding compliance reports and threatening recalls if they faltered in their loyalty. Her empire was showing signs of rebellion, and she was scrambling to hold it together. But the bikers were a different story altogether. For them, the humiliation was personal. They hadn't just been hired muscle, they had been the face of intimidation, the weapon meant to crush resistance. And instead of fear, they had walked away carrying something unfamiliar: shame. The leader, the man with the scar, had expected his reputation to carry the day. He had strutted into our driveway believing the neighborhood would tremble, that my wife would crumble. Instead, he had left with his pride in pieces, his men scattering in disarray. It didn't take long for the ripple effects to reach us. A few days after their retreat, I noticed one of the bikers riding alone down the street, slower this time, without the arrogance that had marked their earlier appearances. He didn't stop, didn't glare, didn't rev his engine. He simply rode past, his eyes hidden behind his visor, but his posture betraying unease. Another was spotted at the gas station just outside the neighborhood. His shoulders hunched as he avoided eye contact with anyone who might recognize him. These men, who once thrived on projecting dominance, now carried themselves like shadows of their former selves. Word spread quietly, through the channels of gossip that even the toughest men couldn't silence. The bikers were talking among themselves, questioning whether the money they'd been promised was worth the humiliation they'd endured. Some blamed the president for dragging them into suburban politics. Others whispered that they had messed with someone far more dangerous than they realized. My wife listened to these stories with cautious hope. For weeks, she had lived under the weight of fear, her spirit dimmed by constant intimidation. But now she was beginning to see cracks in the walls that had caged her. The woman who had once trembled at the sound of engines now sat with her shoulders straighter, her eyes clearer, as though she had finally remembered who she was. The president, however, was far from finished. Her pride wouldn't allow her to admit defeat. To her, the biker's failure wasn't a reflection of her poor judgment, it was a betrayal. She redoubled her efforts to paint us as villains, circulating newsletters that accused us of inciting chaos, disrupting harmony, and even endangering the community by provoking dangerous outsiders. The irony was almost laughable, but her loyalists clung to her words like scripture, desperate to believe their leader still held control. Yet the harder she pushed her narrative, the more resistance she encountered. A growing number of residents weren't just questioning her, they were openly challenging her. Small acts of defiance began to appear throughout the neighborhood. A homeowner who had once kept their grass at regulation length let it grow an inch too high. Another painted their shutters a shade darker than allowed. These were minor acts, easy to correct, but they weren't accidents. They were messages, and behind those messages was a truth the president refused to acknowledge. Fear was no longer enough, but fear was still her weapon of choice, and in her desperation she sought to wield it again. The bikers returned one final time, though not in the formation that had once terrorized the block. Only 3 came this time, their numbers halved, their energy subdued. They parked not in our driveway, but at the curb, lingering as though uncertain of their purpose. Their engines idled quietly, a hollow echo of the thunderous arrival that had once shaken the neighborhood. My wife watched from the window, her hands steady against the glass. She didn't flinch this time. She didn't hide. Instead, she stared back, her eyes locked on theirs until the leader shifted uncomfortably and looked away. Within minutes, they were gone again, leaving behind nothing but the faint smell of exhaust and the lingering sense that their campaign had lost its edge. That was the last time they appeared. The HOA president had bet everything on intimidation, and the bikers had failed her. Their absence was more damning than their presence had ever been. Without them, her threats rang hollow, her power diminished to ink on paper and hollow words shouted in meetings. The image she had cultivated of absolute control was shattering, piece by piece. under the weight of her own arrogance. But victory, I knew, wasn't complete. The president still held influence, still had loyalists who feared her wrath more than they valued freedom. The bikers, though gone, were still out there licking their wounds and nursing grudges. And while the neighborhood was shifting, it hadn't yet broken free of her grasp entirely. The real battle was still ahead. My wife understood this too. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the street in gold, she stepped out onto the porch for the first time in weeks without hesitation. She stood tall, breathing deeply of the evening air, and for a moment the quiet seemed to belong to us again. Neighbors glanced her way, some nodding in silent solidarity, others still too cautious to act. But the symbolism of her presence was undeniable. The woman they had tried to break was still standing. And I was no longer simply reacting. I was preparing. The HOA president had sent her bikers. She had weaponized fear, twisted narratives, and sought to tear apart everything we had built. But now, the tide had shifted. The bikers had tasted failure, the neighborhood had seen weakness, and the president's empire was cracking. The storm was far from over, but this time, it wasn't coming for us. It was coming for her. The silence that settled after the bikers' final retreat didn't last long. Like any vacuum of power, it demanded to be filled, and the neighborhood wasted no time in finding its voice. For years, fear had silenced them, shackled them to rules enforced with petty cruelty. But once fear broke, courage found room to grow, and it grew quickly. It began with whispers, tentative and uncertain. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones across driveways, pausing to glance over shoulders before uttering the thoughts they had buried for too long. They murmured about fines that made no sense, threats that felt disproportionate, and the suffocating grip of a woman who believed herself untouchable. What had once been quiet grumblings transformed into conversations with weight, each one layering doubt upon doubt until the president's authority started to collapse beneath its own contradictions. For the board, this shift was poison. The HOA president had always ruled by carefully constructed dominance, bolstered by unwavering loyalty from her chosen circle. She knew that power was only effective if no one questioned it. But as residents began to question everything, cracks appeared in the foundation of her regime. Board meetings, once tightly controlled spectacles where dissent was quashed with a glare, became volatile. Members who had previously parroted her words with robotic obedience now stumbled, uncertain whether aligning with her was still in their best interest. Her charisma, once enough to silence entire rooms, now met resistance in the form of pointed questions and raised eyebrows. One board member, a man known for his strict interpretations of the bylaws, was the first to falter publicly. During a heated meeting, he hesitated when asked to support yet another fine against a neighbor for lawn ornament violations. That hesitation, though fleeting, rippled through the room like a stone cast into still water. Others noticed. Others remembered. And in that hesitation, the illusion of unanimity shattered. The president, of course, sensed it. She doubled down, as all desperate leaders do when control begins to slip. Her newsletters grew longer, dripping with venom and paranoia. She accused residents of plotting against the harmony of the neighborhood, of conspiring with outsiders to destabilize what she had built. Her words, once accepted without question, now read like the ramblings of someone clinging to power with white-knuckled desperation. But the more she ranted, the less convincing she became. Residents began to push back in small but symbolic ways. A garden gnome appeared on one lawn, defiantly placed in violation of her rules. A string of multicolored lights lit up another house, bright and joyful against the sterile uniformities she demanded. Mailboxes were painted slightly off-shade, fences grew an inch taller, and driveways hosted cars not on the approved list. Each act on its own was minor. Together, they formed a rebellion. My wife watched it unfold with a cautious smile, her spirit rekindling with every small act of defiance. Where once she had felt isolated in our struggle, she now saw the neighborhood itself rising beside us, step by step. The people who had turned away when the bikers first rolled in were now turning back, their silence replaced with nods of acknowledgement, with whispered words of support. The president, though, was unraveling. She patrolled the streets with an intensity bordering on mania, her clipboard clutched like a weapon, her eyes scanning for the smallest infraction. She scribbled furiously, issuing violations with such frequency that residents began comparing notes and finding absurd patterns. A mailbox fine twice in 1 week for being both too dull and too shiny. A hedge cited for growing too close to a sidewalk 1 month and too far from it the next. It was clear she wasn't enforcing rules anymore. She was lashing out, punishing those she suspected of disloyalty. And still, the board fractured further. A second member quietly resigned, citing personal reasons, though everyone knew the truth. He wanted no part in the sinking ship. His absence was a wound that the president tried to hide with bravado, but the residents saw it clearly. One by one, her loyalists were peeling away, leaving her increasingly isolated in her crusade. Then came the meeting that changed everything. It was supposed to be routine, another evening where the president stood at the front of the clubhouse dictating rules to a weary audience. But this time, the residents came prepared. One after another, they raised concerns not about lawns or mailboxes, but about the president herself. They questioned the legality of her fines, the transparency of the HOA's finances, and the wisdom of involving bikers in neighborhood disputes. Their voices grew stronger with each accusation, until the room no longer felt like hers to control. The president tried to shout them down, her voice shrill and desperate, but the tide had turned. She wasn't silencing opposition anymore, she was fueling it. Every attempt to reassert control only highlighted her instability. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding her gaze, their loyalty dissolving in real time. By the end of the night, it was clear the neighborhood had changed. She stormed out, red-faced and trembling, but the damage was irreparable. The residents who once feared her now smelled blood in the water. The rebellion had moved beyond whispers and gnomes. It was now a movement, one she couldn't control with fines, threats, or even bikers. But I knew better than to underestimate her desperation. A person like her doesn't surrender gracefully. She wouldn't fade quietly into irrelevance, no matter how much the neighborhood wanted her gone. She would fight until the very end, clinging to whatever fragments of power she could scrape together. And when cornered, she would lash out with all the venom she had left. The bikers may have been gone, but the danger wasn't. If anything, her unraveling made her more unpredictable, more volatile. My wife sensed it too. Though she smiled more often, though she breathed easier in the evenings, there was still a tension in her shoulders, a wariness in her eyes. She knew that the fight wasn't over, that the president still had cards left to play. And she was right. Because while the neighborhood rose against her, while her board fractured and her authority crumbled, the president was already plotting her next move. One that wouldn't involve letters or fines, but something far more dangerous. The storm wasn't over. It was only gathering strength. The days that followed the disastrous board meeting were unlike anything the neighborhood had ever experienced. Where once there had been silence, now there was defiance. Where once residents cowered beneath the weight of letters and fines, they now shared laughter as they compared their violations like trophies. It was no longer a community of submission, it was a community of rebellion. But rebellion breeds desperation in those who fear irrelevance. And the HOA president was drowning in both. Her patrols became frantic. She stalked the streets late into the evening, clipboard clutched so tightly her knuckles turned white, eyes darting as though searching for some shred of control she could salvage. Her newsletters, once polished and authoritative, devolved into rambling tirades riddled with accusations and conspiracy. She accused the residents of being manipulated, of falling under my influence, of forming a cult of disobedience. The irony was not lost on anyone. Still, beneath her unraveling exterior, I sensed something more dangerous than delusion, calculation. She hadn't given up. She hadn't accepted her downfall. She was waiting, plotting, searching for a way to strike back harder than ever. And then, one night, she did. It was a Thursday evening when the quiet was shattered. My wife and I were settling into the first sense of peace we had felt in months when the roar of engines returned. Not the thunderous army of before, but enough to rattle windows and twist stomachs. Headlights sliced through the dark, cutting across our lawn in erratic beams. My wife stiffened, her breath catching, and for a heartbeat, it felt as though the nightmare was beginning again. But this time, something was different. The bikers weren't posturing. They weren't revving their engines in a display of intimidation. They were moving with a frantic, uneven energy, circling not our house but the clubhouse at the center of the neighborhood. Their voices carried across the night, angry, sharp, and unmistakably directed at the president herself. She had brought them back. Or at least she had tried to, but the alliance was broken. From the shadows, we watched as the bikers confronted her, their voices rising in fury. Promises of payment unfulfilled, lies exposed, reputations tarnished by her reckless games. She had tried to weaponize them again, but instead, they had turned on her, their anger spilling into the streets for everyone to hear. Residents gathered in clusters, watching from porches and sidewalks as the woman who had once ruled them cowered before the very men she had unleashed. For the first time, her power wasn't feared, it was ridiculed. Her shrill attempts to command them fell flat, drowned beneath the bikers' laughter and the murmurs of a neighborhood no longer on her side. It ended as quickly as it began. The bikers roared away into the night, leaving her standing alone in the glow of streetlights, humiliated and exposed. She turned, her eyes darting across the crowd of residents who had borne witness to her downfall, and for the first time, there was no authority in her gaze, only fear. The neighborhood had seen her stripped of her armor, and they would never forget it. The following days were a cascade of collapse. Petitions circulated demanding her removal, gathering signatures faster than she could issue citations. Board members who had once sworn loyalty now distanced themselves, their resignations piling up in her mailbox. The newsletters stopped. The patrols ceased. And the woman who had once patrolled the streets like a general retreated into her home. Blinds drawn, her empire reduced to silence. But silence can be deceptive. My wife, though relieved, remained cautious. She knew that people like her rarely went quietly, and her instincts proved correct. The president's final act wasn't one of defiance, but of destruction. Late one night, long after the neighborhood had settled into uneasy peace, a fire alarm shrieked through the air. Flames licked the edge of the clubhouse, smoke billowing into the sky. Panic spread as residents rushed to contain it, forming lines with hoses and buckets. But amidst the chaos, whispers grew. Witnesses swore they had seen her slipping away from the building just before the flames erupted. Her silhouette illuminated by the inferno she had sparked. The clubhouse was saved, barely, but the damage was done. Not to the building, but to her. Any shred of credibility she clung to burned away that night. The neighborhood was no longer debating her competence. They were condemning her as dangerous. The police investigation that followed was swift. Too swift, perhaps, for her liking. Within days, she was removed from her position, not by resignation, but by force. The same officers she had once called to enforce her petty vendettas now escorted her from her home, her shouts of injustice echoing hollowly against the walls of a neighborhood that had already moved on. And just like that, the reign of the president ended. The neighborhood, though scarred, began to heal. The board was rebuilt with new members who sought transparency and fairness, not control. The rules remained, but their enforcement softened, guided by reason rather than malice. The petty tyranny of fines and citations gave way to actual community, to conversations instead of commands. As for my wife, she reclaimed her peace. She no longer flinched at the sound of engines or glanced over her shoulder at every footstep. She gardened again, her hands deep in soil, her laughter ringing out as neighbors stopped to chat. The fear that had once shadowed her was gone, replaced by a quiet strength born from surviving something designed to break her. I watched her with pride, knowing that while the president had sought to tear us down, she had only made us stronger. And the neighborhood? It had learned something too. It learned that power built on fear is brittle. That intimidation only works until courage takes its place. That no matter how strong a tyrant believes themselves to be, they are nothing without the obedience of those they oppress. The bikers were gone, their roar fading into memory. The president was gone, her empire reduced to ashes. What remained was us, the the residents, the neighbors, the people who had chosen to stop being silent. The storm had passed, and in its wake, the sun returned, casting light on a community no longer bound by fear but united by resilience. For my wife and me, it was more than just a victory over an HOA president. It was a reminder that when pushed, even the quietest voices can rise, and even the strongest tyrants can fall. It was the end of her reign and the beginning of something better. And that brings us to the end of this unbelievable story. From the moment the HOA president thought she could control an entire neighborhood with fines, intimidation, and even biker thugs, to the day she was finally exposed and stripped of her power, the journey was nothing short of dramatic. What started as fear and silence turned into strength and unity, and in the end, justice wasn't just served. It was delivered loudly enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. This story proves something important. No matter how much control someone thinks they have, no matter how far they go to intimidate others, the truth always finds its way out. And when people stand together, even the most powerful tyrant can be brought down. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button to show your support, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next wild HOA or Karen drama, and of course, share this video with someone who loves a good story of karma coming full circle. Your support helps these stories reach more people. And trust me, there are plenty more insane tales where this came from. Until next time, remember, stay strong, stand together, and never let a Karen or an HOA decide how you live your life.